Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Kazykhanov, and I welcome you on behalf of the Arms Control Association and the Center for Policy Research of the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy at the University at Albany. We are thrilled to have such an international audience today. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll have two mini panels. The first one will be devoted to current threats to the global nuclear test ban, to potential strategy on how we can resolve accusations of cheating before the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty goes into force. And also we'll discuss how we can reinforce the global test ban during the upcoming review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. During the second panel, we'll have stories from the field from New Mexico, the Marshall Islands, and Kazakhstan. Each panel will be followed by a Q&A. Please use the Q&A tab on your Zoom interface to send us questions. We also received some questions in advance, and we thank you for sending those. We'll try to go through as many questions as we can, time permitting. Today's webinar is one of many reminders that nuclear weapons programs are not happening in a vacuum. They're not abstract. Each of us is affected directly or indirectly by them, be it due to the global nuclear fallout from more than 2,000 nuclear tests, or because our taxpayer money goes to nuclear weapons program instead of public health and education. Not to mention the ever-present risk of a nuclear war with which we all have to live. We are hosting this webinar on the occasion of the UN International Day Against Nuclear Tests, which is commemorated annually on the initiative of Kazakhstan. And therefore it gives me immense pleasure to introduce and welcome Ambassador of Kazakhstan to the United States, Erzhan Kazykhanov, to open our webinar with his welcome remarks. Please, Ambassador, thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning, Tokjan, Daryl, distinguished guests and participants. I'm delighted to join you here on the occasion of the International Day Against Nuclear Tests. And I would like to thank the Arms Control Association and the Center for Policy Research at the University at Albany for hosting this very important event. As you know, at the initiative of Kazakhstan in 2009, the United Nations General Assembly declared 29th of August the International Day Against Nuclear Tests, marking the closing of one of the largest nuclear test sites in Semipalatinsk in 1991. More than 450 tests took place on Kazakh territory, which is almost a quarter of all tests have taken place in the world, with aftermath still being felt decades later. 1.5 million of my fellow citizens has been severely impacted and suffered immeasurably. The purpose of the day is twofold. First, to pay tribute to the victims of nuclear tests, and second, to raise the awareness of the continued threat that such tests pose to the environment and international security. But most importantly, the International Day Against Nuclear Tests provides an opportunity to send a clear and unmistakable message to the international community that our work is not yet done. The business of ending nuclear tests for all times remains unfinished. For this reason, it is our hope that today's commemoration will help to inspire countries to take concrete measures that will allow us to finally reach our objective of the world's free from the danger of nuclear testing. And the only path that will lead us to those noble goals is through the verifiability of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and its universalization. Today, we honor the memory of all victims of nuclear tests from all over the world and pay our respects to those whose lives have been adversely affected. We owe to them and to the generation unborn not to repeat the horror of nuclear tests and nuclear weapons explosions. Kazakhstan also successfully negotiated the Central Asian Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone Treaty, which came into force in 2009. The treaty, also known as Semipalatinsk Treaty, forbids 5 Central Asian countries from conducting, researching on, developing, stockpiling, or testing nuclear weapons. But the risk of nuclear proliferation and the threat of nuclear terrorism continue to pose great challenges to the international community. We are moving through a dangerous period, one marked by tensions between nuclear-armed states. These differences can only be resolved through dialogue. World's nuclear states have to explore the possibilities of opening new avenues of cooperation rather than abandoning the hard-fought non-proliferation and disarmament treaties. We believe that the trust, willpower, and intelligence of the international community, amplified by the energy of collective actions, will prevent our planet from plunging into the abyss of global catastrophe. I wish today's event to be productive and once again raise the awareness of these global problems. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. We are so grateful for your support, and we are very grateful that you're taking part in this webinar and that you offered your welcome to all the participants. Thank you. To start us off on our discussion on the policy issues, we have 2 outstanding speakers. Daryl Kimball is the director of the Arms Control Association, an organization that won a Genius Award from MacArthur Foundation. Daryl has been working on issues of nuclear testing for decades, really, even before he joined the Arms Control Association. Our second speaker, Gohar Muhajanova, is the director of the International Organizations and Non-Proliferation Program of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. Anyone who knows Gohar knows that she's one of the best experts on anything NPT related. So I cannot think of a better speaker to start us off on a conversation on how states can reinforce the test ban during the upcoming REFCON, whenever that might take place. So first we'll start with Daryl and then Gohar. Daryl, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Togjan. Thanks everyone for being with us and for so many people tuning in. As we just heard from the ambassador, not only have the world's 2,000 nuclear test explosions inflicted widespread health and environmental damage, but those nuclear tests have fueled an arms race. But since the conclusion of the test ban treaty in '96, nuclear testing has been considered taboo. Only one country has conducted nuclear test explosions in this century, that's North Korea, and even it has halted its nuclear testing program. Without the option to conduct nuclear tests, it's more difficult, though not impossible, for even the most advanced nuclear states to develop, prove, and field new design nuclear warheads. But we can't take the nuclear testing taboo for granted, because a group of 8 CTBT rogue states, I call them, the United States, China, Israel, Iran, Egypt, India, Pakistan, and North Korea, have not yet ratified the treaty, and it has not formally entered into force. So as a result, the door to nuclear testing remains ajar. And that also means that the treaty's option for short notice on-site inspections can't be deployed yet in order to detect and deter violations of the test ban. So in a few minutes I want to outline some of the options for dealing with 2 significant threats to the non-testing norm that have emerged in just the past year, and to outline some ideas about what needs to be done to head them off. So first, the threat of renewed US nuclear weapons testing. As many of you know, in 2018, the Trump administration said it would not pursue ratification of the CTBT. Then, in something of a surprise, in May of this year, the Washington Post reported that senior national security officials discussed the options of a demonstration nuclear blast by the United States to put pressure on Russia and China in some future arms control talks. And then later, in an interview in July, former National Security Advisor John Bolton confirmed that the administration had discussed the possibility of resuming testing. Worse yet, the Senate Armed Services Committee approved a Republican proposal for adding $10 million for to execute a nuclear test if the president so desired. So what are we talking about? This is it would be a simple demonstration nuclear blast, not to test some defect with an existing warhead, but to demonstrate that the United States could still conduct nuclear test explosions. It would be done without sophisticated instrumentation, and so it could be done within a matter of just a few weeks or months at the Nevada test site. The full Senate refused to have a vote on this issue, but in the House of Representatives, the House passed an amendment that prohibits funding for nuclear testing in the next year. So these differences still have to be resolved in the House-Senate Conference Committee. But I think clearly due to the public outcry about the lunacy of resuming US nuclear testing after 28 years, it's very unlikely the United States will resume nuclear testing anytime soon. But without ratification of the CTB by the US or another type of legislative prohibition against US testing, a future president could still announce the United States will unsign the CTBT and order the resumption of nuclear testing. So what could be done to block potential US nuclear testing short of entry into force? In my view, it's at least two things. I mean, first, the international community needs to respond clearly and strongly. All responsible states need to reiterate at the highest levels their opposition to the resumption of nuclear testing by the United States or any other state, and reiterate their strong support for the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and the actions necessary to bring the treaty into force. And second, here in the United States, the Congress needs to act again to bring into law legislation that would require a vote on possible US nuclear testing in the future. I believe it needs to be at least a 2/3 majority approving resumption of testing if a future president proposes that. Legislation was introduced just this year by Senator Cortez Masto of Nevada and others that would put this in place. So that is a future issue that we here in the United States, I hope we'll be looking at next year, no matter who wins the presidential election. The second danger to the non-testing norm I want to mention is the possibility that there is some state conducting low-level nuclear testing before the CTBT enters into force, or the possibility that there are unresolved accusations that such testing has occurred. And we are in just that latter situation. In May of last year, the United States charged that, and I quote, "Russia probably is not adhering to its nuclear testing moratorium in a manner consistent with the zero yield standard outlined in the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty." And then this year, the accusation was repeated, but in a milder form. And the State Department stated in a report that sometime during the 1995 to 2018 timeframe, Russia probably conducted nuclear weapons related tests at Novaya Zemlya, the northern island where Russia has conducted nuclear tests in the Cold War period. The US has not provided further details. Russia, of course, has vigorously denied the charges, calling the accusation a crude provocation, and pointed to the United States' failure to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty itself. These US claims, of course, coincide with the Trump administration discussions about resuming US testing, and it may simply be a cynical attempt to justify such a move. Nevertheless, this is a serious accusation that I believe requires a serious governmental and international response, because all Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty countries agree that the treaty prohibits any nuclear weapon test explosion or any other nuclear explosion, no matter what the yield of that explosion might be. So we have to remember too that the US, China, and Russia, all CTBT signatories, continue to engage in activities at their former testing sites, and only France has permanently closed its former test site in the Pacific. So while the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty's monitoring system is fully operational, it can be very difficult for it to detect very low yield nuclear weapon test explosions. And we probably can't detect those explosions without on-site monitoring equipment or on-site inspections. So the most effective way to deal with this, of course, is to bring the CTBT into force so that we can bring into effect all of the verification and monitoring tools the CTBT has to offer. But pending entry into force, we need to think about what needs to be done in order to address these accusations of non-compliance with the test ban norm. So in my view, CTB states should encourage former testing states to agree on mutual confidence building measures such as notification and exchange of information about certain experiments that might be conducted at former test sites, and agree to install additional sensing devices and other measuring devices to make sure that non-compliant nuclear test explosions are not taking place. Now, Russia, when presented with this idea, says such measures should only be pursued after entering into force. In my view, that's an outdated and unnecessary and unhelpful position, given the reality that the CTBT is not going to enter into force for many years. If Russia truly supports CTBT entering into force, it could leverage progress by agreeing to implement these voluntary reciprocal transparency measures after the United States ratifies the CTBT. And if the United States has credible evidence that Russia is violating the CTB, and it is far from clear that it does, the United States should make that information available. And if it's concerned about these activities, it should be interested in negotiating transparency arrangements to build mutual confidence that neither country is conducting activities that are inconsistent with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So, as I said at the start, and I'll say again to close, the CTBT has, despite the fact that it hasn't entered into force, it has established a powerful taboo against nuclear testing that every country in the world respects and understands, but we can't take that for granted. And we have to take every opportunity to shut the door on nuclear testing forever, especially in these difficult international times. So let me stop there, Togjan, and we'll move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Daryl. You gave us so much substance. Let's now go to Gohar. Gohar, please.
Thank you, Erzhan. Thank you very much for organizing this panel and for inviting me to be on it. It's really a pleasure to share the screen in this sense with such great people who have worked on the CTBT and NPT issues in some cases for literally decades, as you said. So I've been asked to talk a little bit more about this connection between the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and Prohibition of Nuclear Testing and the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and tie it closer to the upcoming 10th NPT Review Conference. And indeed, it's impossible to deny the connection between the two treaties. The call for a ban on nuclear testing itself indeed predates the call for a non-proliferation treaty. And I think at some points in that early history of the nuclear age, maybe even more than the fear of nuclear war, the evident impact of nuclear testing on communities, on individuals, on public health was the focal point for the broader general audience to rally and protest against nuclear weapons. So including a prohibition on nuclear testing in the provisions of the NPT itself was one of the goals for several non-nuclear weapon states, which unfortunately could not be achieved during the negotiations in the 18-nation Disarmament Committee. But that is why the aspiration for such comprehensive prohibition of nuclear testing is reflected in the preamble of the NPT. So it's really part, the pursuit of that prohibition on nuclear testing is woven into the fabric of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and its review process. And throughout the 1980s, before the negotiations started in earnest, the subject of concluding a comprehensive test ban came up at the NPT review process meetings repeatedly and was often a subject of disagreement. And in the 1990 NPT Review Conference, quite famously ended without a final document, precisely because of the disagreement on the language over the test ban. And it was a principled position of Mexico in particular at the time that there simply cannot be a consensus outcome of an NPT Review Conference that does not endorse the importance of a comprehensive prohibition of nuclear testing and the need to conclude a legally binding treaty on that subject. And I think at that point, the nuclear weapon states heard the message quite loud and clear. And subsequently, a CTBT was integral to every action-oriented, forward-looking NPT review process outcome document. starting with the 1995 Review and Extension Conference, where the decision to conclude CTBT negotiations by 1996 was an essential part of principles and objectives for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation that were part of the package of decisions that allowed the NPT to be extended indefinitely. Achievement of early entry into force of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty was one of the 13 practical steps 5 years later as part of the 2000 NPT Review Conference outcome. And in 2010, as many as 5 action items in the NPT action plan were devoted to the CTBT and nuclear testing. So clearly, throughout the NPT review process history, and any time that the NPT Review Conference managed to adopt a forward-looking action plan with anything to do on nuclear disarmament, nuclear testing and CTBT were part of it. Now, arguably, subsequently, since 2010 at least, the focus of the review process meetings has not been as much on nuclear testing. The humanitarian initiative didn't, while highlighting the impacts of nuclear testing itself, did not focus on the treaty, right, on the CTBT. It was speaking more to the legal prohibition of nuclear weapons writ large. But part of the reason for that is perhaps the very success of that norm that Daryl spoke about, that it's become such a taboo in the minds of all of us that nuclear testing simply is unthinkable to restart in this day and age. So it became sort of a political subject, that CTBT has their political difficulties with its entry into force, and we can keep calling on the relevant states to sign and ratify, but there was no perceived need to make that any kind of central subject for the review conferences. And now we are in this bizarre reality where at least one nuclear weapon state has been sort of toying with the idea of possibly restarting nuclear testing. The same state speaking about designing new warheads. Goodness knows what other nuclear weapon states might want to follow down that path. And of course, designing a whole new warhead requires testing. And now all of a sudden, in the year of the 50th anniversary of the NPT and the 25th anniversary of its indefinite extension, or the conversation about nuclear testing has moved from the more abstract to an actual resurging threat, and not because of North Korea, but North Korea as well. So what to do? How to address that? And here, I had to compromise a little bit in thinking about the steps that could be taken, the things that states could do, and I think that should be a starting point for diplomats and policymakers, as well as they prepare for the review conference on what they can and want to say about the CTBT. And the tightrope we're walking is what should be done and what realistically can be agreed, and whether that would indeed be raising a particular subject that would only highlight the divisions, whether that would be actually useful for the CTBT in the longer run. Right now, all eyes are on the United States, both because it's the one nuclear weapon state that talked about possibly restarting nuclear testing, however close that meeting and conversation might have been, and also because it's seen as the key to ratifications, and because the upcoming elections in November have the potential to change the US position on the CTBT once again. But until we know the outcome of that election, we can't really foretell what position this key nuclear weapon state would take at the upcoming review conference. And even should a Democrat be elected in November, considering the state of everything else in the United States and also in the nuclear arms control, I don't think CTBT will be a very high priority for the next Democratic president. And that's something that it's just a reality that we have to contend with. And so start from there and think about, okay, how can we uphold the CTBT and its goals, but without making that a sort of a too divisive subject, because ultimately it can hurt the treaty itself, because so far it hasn't enjoyed a consensus support whenever there was an outcome document since 1995. So to begin with, and recalling the history and the mutually intertwined history of non-proliferation pursuit and pursuit of prohibition of nuclear testing, states parties at the next review conference, in light of commemorating the 50th anniversary of the NPT and the 25th anniversary of definite extension should emphasize how the prohibition of nuclear testing is integral to achieving the goals of the NPT, both in terms of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. And in this regard, we affirm, of course, the centrality of the CTBT itself and the necessity of its entry into force. So far, so good, broad enough. But then states could specifically recall the action items related to the CTBT and prohibition of nuclear testing from past outcomes. And this, surprisingly, the question of past commitments has become a bit of a hot subject in the run-up to the 10th Review Conference. So I think it's important for all states to reaffirm past commitments and recall of them, some of them in their specificity. They have to reaffirm their validity, but also where necessary, update them. If you look at especially the action items from 2010, I think there are too many of them. I think the language got a bit diluted. It's entirely possible to consolidate them a bit. Some of them could be reaffirmed in the entirety, like Action 11, which specifically calls on states not only to move towards the entry into force of CTBT, but while pending its entry into force, to not act in a way that would defeat the object of the treaty. In light of the recent developments, I think that is a very important reaffirmation that states could make and commit themselves, right, to act in accordance with the goals of the CTBT. But then they could attempt to right the wrong, so to say, of the 2010 action plan and some of the language related to the responsibilities of states. In 2010, somehow the signatory states were let off the hook, and some of the responsibilities for promoting the entry into force, supporting the CTBTO, etc., were assigned to states that have already ratified the CTBT. I think it would be important to broaden that circle and have the signatory states also commit themselves to promote the entry into force, to do what they have to do to bring it closer. And speaking of the CTBTO, states should uphold the importance of maintaining and supporting CTBTO, even if while they understand, as we discussed earlier, that the entry of the CTBT may not be on the horizon because of different priorities and different competing developments. But even as we don't expect CTBT necessarily to enter into force next year or in the next 5 years, to commit to maintain the organization that is established through that treaty, to provide the necessary support. And recently, the subject of electing the next executive secretary of the Preparatory Commission brought to light the sorry state of contributions, assessed payments. How many states have actually lost their voting rights because they haven't been paying? I think it would be a very material way for states to reaffirm their support, to pledge to provide the appropriate and timely funding for the organization, and those who are in position to do so to once again pledge to provide additional voluntary contributions, because let's be realistic. The next U.S. administration, even if it is democratic, will not move on CTBT ratification first thing in the morning on January 21st. And so we all have to be a bit patient with that. And then states parties need to reaffirm that they are prepared to support the CTBTO and stand by the treaty, even if it takes longer than they would like for it to come into force. And so these are, I try to list the more concrete steps that states could do and pledge themselves to, in addition to the usual, of course, call for those who have to ratify it to bring the treaty into force to actually do so. And then one more thing, and that has a potential to be also quite controversial. I think states should be more concrete in their pledges as to what they want or plan or wish to do to promote the entry into force. And that might have to do with their interactions with countries outside the NPT, whose ratification of the CTBT is essential for its entry into force. And here we are coming to the subject of India and nuclear cooperation with India, and the subject of membership in the nuclear suppliers group. I think at a minimum, states members of the nuclear suppliers group should pledge that they won't accept any new members that are not party to the CTBT and do not pledge to prohibit nuclear testing. I think this is the little thing that states have to commit if they want to speak in more practical and concrete terms about how they want to promote the entry into force of the CTBT. I will stop there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Gohar, and I appreciate very much from both of the speakers that you not only identified the issues, but you gave some very practical, sober, and realistic suggestions. We already have quite a few questions starting to come in, and we received some questions in advance. So let me use this chance and put a few questions in one go, and then you can pick them up. The first question, which I think both of you might want to address, is how can the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons best be used to address the needs of survivors of nuclear use and testing and cleanup contamination? And a couple of questions, I think probably, Daryl, up your alley. Given the US failure to ratify CTBT, how would a congressional prohibition on testing impact the CTBT itself? And one more, if you permit me. In addition to the CTBTO's IMS system, do you see any potential for better monitoring of very low yield events from the progress being made by the seismology community? And that is more widespread and fine-tuned sensing and better big data analysis to distinguish natural from man-made seismic events. Thank you.
Well, Gohar, would you like to start with the first one?
You on the TPNW? Yeah.
Yes.
So nuclear testing was a bit of a controversial subject in the negotiation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, precisely because there already exists a treaty prohibiting nuclear testing, but to the taste of some states, not comprehensively enough. So that was one part of the discussion on including the prohibition of nuclear testing in the TPNW. The other part was the fact that the CTBT does not address the humanitarian side of things, the needs and impact of the affected population. And so the TPNW included the positive obligations, and that is that states commit to provide rehabilitation and assistance to those affected by nuclear testing or use. I don't have the text of the TPNW in front of me, but I think, unfortunately, it commits only the states that conducted testing. So it really places, I mean, in a sense, rightly so, it places the responsibility and the burden on those who conducted testing. But the fact that those who conducted testing are expressly opposed to the TPNW doesn't help the affected populations at this point of time. I think what the TPNW states parties could do, those on whose territory testing was conducted, is I think take that step further and take greater responsibility for providing the assistance and rehabilitation to their affected populations. And they can do that through the meetings of states parties, for example. It's certainly a subject that I think states can bring up once the treaty is in force and the states parties meet periodically. They can set certain objectives. They certainly can exchange at least the experience of the rehabilitation of sites, the assistance provided to population, the health impacts research, and I thought there was a little discussion in the beginning before we started about what kinds of studies on the impact were conducted here and there. I think TPNW could be a good forum for the affected states to exchange that kind of information, although some of the affected countries are not joining the TPNW soon, but at least those that are, I think, could really assist each other, and in that sense help assist the people that were affected on their territories.
Well, on the two other questions that were asked, how does congressional prohibition on U.S. nuclear testing affect the CTBT? Technically it doesn't. The United States is a signatory. The United States is obligated not to take actions contrary to the object and purpose of the treaty. But under certain presidential administrations, that's not a particularly strong barrier against preparations for nuclear testing or actual nuclear testing. So, Congress, we have to remember, Congress was critical in moving the United States to stop nuclear testing in 1992-93. Congress has an important role to play in U.S. policy, and it has the power to prohibit the use of taxpayer funds to resume nuclear testing if a president proposes that. One quick addition to the question on how the TPNW assists, as Gohar said, the states parties to the TPNW, who are not technically responsible for providing assistance under the treaty, still could, as some of us have recommended in past years at the International Day of Nuclear Test events, create a fund, a pooled fund for to help support efforts to assist victims and survivors in the countries affected. It could be administered by the United Nations. You know, that is an approach that's been used on many issues in the national context. And the question about whether seismic networks used by academics and earthquake scientists can be helpful in monitoring for prohibited nuclear test explosions. Yes, they can be very, very helpful. It augments the official international monitoring system that the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization administers. That information could be pulled into an assessment of whether a state has violated the CTBT, but until this CTBT enters into force, you know, that can't officially be used to lead to an on-site inspection determination that state has violated the treaty. In addition, the test that I'm talking about, that the United States is accusing Russia of conducting, very low yield. We're talking about pounds of explosive yield, not the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of tons explosions that we've seen with nuclear testing in the past. So those types of tests can be very hard to detect unless you've got equipment on the ground monitoring for these very low yield, tiny detonations, which are still prohibited by the treaty.
Thank you both, Daryl and Gohar. I'll try to fit in a couple more questions. One of the questions we received is the following. Are US accusations that Russia is performing CTBT prohibited activities at Novaya Zemlya, you know, true or untrue, likely to lead to Trump administration attempts to exit the CTBT? And I've noticed Gohar in her remarks, she mentioned that she thinks that any new warhead development will require a test. I just wanted to see whether, Daryl, you also can chime in, because we had a question that we received in advance, and it's the following. Can the advanced nuclear nations develop new design warheads without resumed testing? So please, Gohar. On whether Trump will try to exit the CTBT.
That was my concern when the accusations against Russia surfaced first, because that seemed like a path that was followed on some, at the INF at least. That and of course Bolton being in administration at that time, I thought this could be a sort of a perfect path to unsigning the CTBT. I think right now, thankfully perhaps, President Trump is distracted with other things. So it may not be very high on his agenda, but of course, if Congress forcefully moves to limit his actions, it could be one of those spiteful moves that don't cost him very much to declare the signature of the CTBT. And indeed, the Trump administration already unsigned the arms trade treaty. So, haven't seen the last 3.5 years, I can't declare anything impossible with regard to treaty withdrawal and destruction of arms control architecture. But I don't necessarily think that it would be high sort of on the agenda.
Daryl?
Yeah, I would agree with that answer. It could be an excuse for those who might want to unsign the CTBT. In the Trump administration, whether these accusations are true or not true. I frankly do not know. I haven't seen the classified intelligence that the Trump administration says supports this accusation, but it is my view based upon a number of different data points that this is actually an old accusation that has been made in the past. It has not reached this level of official sanction before. This is probably, therefore, a difference in interpretation about what certain Russian activities at Novaya Zemlya might mean. You notice the language the Trump administration has used about their suspicions about Russian activities. It uses the word probably, so in intelligence assessment terms, this is not a very high level of confidence. And the fact that they're talking about they could have conducted non-compliant activities anytime between 1995 and 2018, that is a long period of time. So I don't see this as as some intelligence officials like to say, a slam dunk by any means. And if there's real information, solid information, I think the Trump administration has a responsibility to describe it in greater detail.
Thank you both so much. And we have more excellent questions that I can see in the chat. We will need to move to our next panel, but I encourage anybody who is interacting with the speakers right now through the Q&A tab. I know both of them are very open to exchange of views, and you can follow up with them directly. Sometimes it might seem that what is happening in Vienna, New York, Geneva, nuclear capitals of the world has very little to do with the day-to-day life of people, right? It does sound quite abstract. I notice it in conversation with people who do not work in the nuclear field, that they're often surprised that there are still nuclear weapons or that there was nuclear testing. But it's clear that it's not the case, and all those decisions directly affect people. And to drive this point home, we have three fantastic speakers. Tina Cordova, she's doing terrific work to help the victims of the first ever nuclear explosion, the Trinity test. Desmond Dolatram is the researcher with the Republic of the Marshall Islands National Nuclear Commission. He's also a professor at the College of the Marshall Islands. It's 1:30 a.m. in Majuro from where he's joining us. And so we're extremely grateful, Desmond, for staying up to tell us your story. And finally, we also have Alimzhan Akhmetov, a founder and the director of the Center for International Security and Policy. He's joining us from Kazakhstan's capital, Nur-Sultan. Alimzhan works with Kazakhstan's victims of Soviet nuclear tests. I just thank you, three of you, for all the work you are doing, and we're very grateful that you are joining us today. I want to give the floor to Tina, please.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Tina Cordova, and I'm co-founder of the Tugo-Sabayan Downwinders Consortium, or DDC for short. We're a graphics organization that was founded 15 years ago to bring attention to the negative health effects suffered by the people of New Mexico as a result of their exposure to radiation from the first nuclear test that took place in the desert of South Central New Mexico. I want to thank Daryl and the Arms Control Association for putting together this webinar and for inviting me to participate. It's a great opportunity for me to remind everybody about what took place in New Mexico 75 years ago this past July. I am a downwinder and I am a cancer survivor. I was born in a community 40 miles away, crows fly, from the Trinity test site. And while the US government has been exceptionally good at controlling the messaging and saying then and continuing to say today that no one lived in the area of the Trinity test site, that is indeed true. There were tens of thousands of people living in a 50-mile radius, and we've identified ranch families that lived as close as 12 miles to the site. US government made the decision at the time not to evacuate anybody and not to warn us before or afterwards. To give you a sense for what took place July 16, 1945, I want to tell you a little about the uniqueness of Trinity test and why it's so harmful to human health. It was the only time that the US government ever tested a nuclear device on a platform 100 feet to the ground. The test actually had no place to go. The impact of the test came down, intersected the earth, and then took up an enormous amount of dirt, plant, animals, and incinerated it, and took over 7 miles past the atmosphere into the stratosphere. The test produced more heat, more light than the sun, but it produced very little destruction. It produced enormous fallout. And the US government learned from the test that this is not what they wanted as they went to Japan. What they wanted to in Japan produce destruction and not fallout. The other thing I want to talk about is that the test at Trinity was incredibly inefficient. They packed the bomb with 13-pound weapons-grade plutonium, but only 3 pounds of that plutonium was necessary for the fission process, which means over 10 pounds of plutonium went in that fireball and then fell down days and days and days afterwards as an ash that got on everything. I want to also express to everybody what life was like in 1945 in rural New Mexico, so that people can get a feel for why this had such great impact on human health. First of all, we didn't have running water. There were no water. No one had water tap with no running water. So we relied on the collection of rainwater for every purpose, the purpose of drinking, cooking, bathing, cleaning, doing laundry. And July, our rainy season, it's when we received most of the moisture that we received in Mexico. So we had massive rain, thunderstorms take place in July, and the history of this is very clear. They actually wait for a break in the thunderstorm existed that night to actually take the bomb that morning. So people would have been collecting water in their cisterns, and ash fell from the sky, and it rained very heavy that day. It brought down the largest particles of radiation. That was then deposited in people's cisterns. It was deposited in our lakes, our rivers, our streams, our ditches, that was vital to our existence. The other thing that we didn't have in 1945 is refrigeration. No one owned a refrigerator. Some people might have an ice box. It was a thriving ice plant in most little rural towns. But we didn't have refrigerators, so there were no grocery stores. And what you didn't do is go someplace and buy things like dairy, produce, meat. All of those things had to be produced ourselves. So people had gardens, and they had orchards, and they had milk cows, and they had milk goats. We raised sheep and pigs and chicken, and that was our main source of meat and milk and dairy, and all of those gardens that people own, all of those orchards that they own, that they cultivated, women actually would have been in July at the peak of the harvest, harvesting as many things as they could, putting those away in jars, can them, and then also drying them for the winter. And so now our food source was affected by the radiation that fell from the sky and got onto the earth and became part of the environment. Our environment was horribly invaded by the radiation that was produced from the Trinity. So let me talk a little bit about the history of human health consequences. So I'm the 4th generation in my family since 1945 with cancer. I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer when I was 39 years old. 2 of my great-grandfathers died of cancer in 1955, 10 years after the bomb, from what they call stomach cancer. My two grandmothers both had cancer, although they didn't die of cancer. My father died from cancer in 2013, had 3 different cancers he didn't have risk factors for. 2 of them were oral cancers, and my dad didn't drink alcohol, didn't smoke cigarettes, didn't use chewing tobacco, had no viruses, and had 2 distinctly different cancers. And when I talked to the oncologist that treated him, they said it just doesn't happen, especially in somebody with no risk factors. But it does happen to us. And we documented tens of thousands of people actually who have had cancers, and clusters in families for entire families have been wiped out. And so we have existed inside of this process that has robbed us of our health. And I don't think people realize that when communities are so sick, And when people are left to spend all that they have on the health consequences, it takes a huge economic toll on families, on communities, and it robs us of our ability to develop any kind of generational wealth. And because of that, we don't have much to pass on. And people have told me when I was diagnosed with cancer, I used my retirement to pay for the trip I had to make out of town for treatment. And then I took out all the assets I had in home, and I maxed out 3 credit cards. And now I'm so far into debt, and my kids are sending me money to buy gas so I can get back and forth to my treatments. The unfortunate thing is that in most of rural Mexico, we don't have facilities where we can diagnose or treat it when we do become sick. Our goal, our ultimate goal at the BBC has always been to bring attention to these negative health effects, but also to appeal to the US government to come back, acknowledge the harm that's been done to the people of New Mexico, and then provide us compensation and the healthcare coverage that we so desperately need to address this problem. We have had bills entered in Congress for 10 years now. There's a current bill, House Bill 3783, that would extend compensation to us, extend what's called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act for additional years to make up for the 30 years we've been denied access. And it would also modernize the program, because now downwinders of the Nevada test site can apply and they risk $50,000, which is obviously not, absolutely not adequate. And so we're fighting for hearings in House Judiciary Committee. People ask me all the time what they can do to assist, and I tell them, reach out to your members of Congress, ask them to be co-sponsors of these bills, ask them to do the right thing. There is definitely a moral and ethical imperative to right this wrong, and we need hearings in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives, and we need these bills to be passed. And so with that, I will end this part of my presentation, and I will stand questions when the time comes. And I appreciate this opportunity, and I wish everybody well on this day. And let me just say one thing in closing. There is never a safe test. They'll tell you that these things are safe, and seemingly they are right up until the minute they're not. And then when not, it's catastrophic, and nobody come back to help you. And I can attest to this because we've been waiting 75 years. Thank you.
Tina, thank you so much for sharing the story of the community, but also for trusting us with your own personal story. We appreciate it very much, and I look forward to engaging you more during the Q&A. Desmond, please go ahead.
Hello, obviously, Dr. Togzhan has already introduced me. I work with the National Nuclear Commission as their researcher. The Marshall Islands, he was used as ground zero for the nuclear testing program for the United States when it won the war against Japan in World War II. If you guys are unaware, the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, which included the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, and Northern Marianas, also served as a strategic area for the US when it dropped the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In fact, those bombs were loaded in Tinian in Northern Marianas and dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. And a year later, they came to the Marshall Islands and tested 23 bombs in Bikini and 44 in Eniwetok. Now, if you guys are unaware, that's about 80% of the entire yield of the American nuclear testing program. It equates to about 108 megatons. So to put that into perspective, that's about 1.6 Hiroshima bombs being detonated every day for the entire 12 years of testing. About 6.3 billion curies of iodine-131 was released into the Marshall Islands. And today, the US only acknowledges 4 atolls, which would be the 2 testing sites, Bikini and Eniwetok, and the 2 downwinder sites, which would be Rongelap and Utruk, which received the fallout. The main narrative that the United States has always pushed forth is that it was an accident. Now, as a researcher, I'm a novice researcher, and for me to find these things out, I actually had to interview several of the Bravo victims. And you hear their stories about them thinking that the fallout was snow because they've never seen snow and they've heard stories. So they thought it was something like they could play with. Some actually put it in their hair thinking that it was some kind of powder detergent, and they would take it home and their hair starts falling off. These kinds of stories are very common amongst downwinders. And the saddest part is because the United States only recognizes 4 of the atolls, some of the atolls that actually received fallout did not receive any compensation nor legal recognition. Now, as part of the Pacific Islands Trust Territory United Nations Trusteeship Agreement, the United States was already required to promote the economic self-sufficiency of the island, promote adequate health care, and of course, protect the inhabitants and their land and their resources, natural resources. This was a community of subsistence lifestyle. They fished and farmed for their own food. They were largely independent. Nowadays, 90% of our food is imported, and we are governed, the economic policy and the strategic policy that governs our relationship right now with the United States is called the Compact of Free Association. And legally, they've only put 4 atolls as recognized as being affected by the nuclear testing program, which omits all of the Marshallese that weren't in those 4 atolls. Another thing I wanted to bring up was this project called Project 4.1, in which the nuclear downwinders of the Bravo test were taken from their atolls and then put in a military base in Kwajalein, I believe, and then they were tested. Some of these invasive procedures included fecal samples, and they also had control groups for people from Rongelap, in which people who weren't at Rongelap at the time were taken in and compared with people that were affected by the fallout directly. So these would include people having to drink radioactive substances, so they could compare people who were directly affected by Bravo versus those who were injected or who had to drink fallout. These are some of the stories that as I grew up, I found out later, because you don't find it in any American history textbook. And I believe this is where the issue is, this history of censorship. Up until 1968, nobody was allowed in or out of the Marshall Islands without express permission from the admiral in Guam. About 5 places in Micronesia are associated with the United States: Guam, the territory; Northern Marianas, the Commonwealth; and then the 3 Compact of Free Association states, which include FSM, Palau, and of course, the Republic of the Marshall Islands. To make matters worse, the Marshall Islands has no oncologist on island. The Compact of Free Association that governs the relationship between the nuclear victims also, they actually have health treatment, but through the Department of Energy, but there's no oncologist on island for immediate treatment should they fall victim to cancerous impacts. These are some of the largest issues that I see even as a citizen, and I'm learning as I go, but I believe this is where the work of the National Nuclear Commission is important. It actually came into fruition from grassroots movements trying to push this issue, because under the Compact of Free Association, the US wants to espouse, like they don't want to take responsibility for their nuclear testing program. A nuclear claims tribunal was established later after the compact was enacted, so that the Marshall Islands could assess the damages, the legal damages, including environmental damages and new claimants should they arise. And the process that was agreed upon was the change circumstance petition, in which if new circumstances arise, such as new data, new declassified information, then the Marshall Islands could appeal for more compensation. This report still sits with Congress with no formal response. It was submitted in 2000, and right now under Compact 3 negotiations, the Marshall Islands is trying to reword the CCP or adapt it and resubmit it. It is very, very difficult, especially for people here with a sense of lost hope, being treated as lab rats. If you hear the narratives of the United States, they'd always say that it's an accident. But when you do research and you hear stuff from the weatherman, as Tina was also explaining with their experience, it seems like, there was no accident. People weren't evacuated. In fact, when they tested the first Hiroshima-sized bomb, they evacuated neighboring atolls from Bikini. But when they detonated Bravo, which was predicted to be about 250 to 500 times the size of Bravo, nobody was evacuated. And that bomb turned out to be 1,000 times the yield as Bravo. So these are some evidence that people have been talking about. And I believe the main thing we can do right now is try and, I guess, spread awareness on this issue, because most Americans are ignorant to the fact that 67 nuclear bombs were tested in the Marshall Islands. Even most Marshallese are unaware of what really happened here. To this day, we're still trying to find out what the United States was actually doing here, because a lot of the documents have been classified and they haven't been released. There can really be no closure without full disclosure. And as I look at the issue, I see that there is that narrative being controlled that it was an accident and it was for the good of mankind. But if you hear from these victims directly at what they're experiencing now that they can't even grow food in their own radiated homeland and rely on canned food, it's like diabetes. Like, you just took away their own means of sustenance. It becomes really, really even more depressing when you see that these people were one of the most skilled navigators in the world, and they were taken and dislocated and now are largely dependent on US funding, and they can't, I guess, better themselves legally because of the structural violence of the Compact for Free Association, in which they were forced to abdicate their rights. In many ways, the way I see it is, it's not that the Marshallese or like the nuclear affected communities are lazy. They're actually really, really great advocates. It's just a lack of listeners or a lack of awareness, because, up until the 1960s, nobody was allowed in and out of the Marshall Islands because of the nuclear testing program. Most Americans don't know about it. And I know Americans are not bad people. I mean, if they know about this, they would have actually pushed for greater compensation. And on 1996, the Marshallese were eligible to go to Hawaii for like Medicaid or get some health care. But right after the 1996 Welfare Reform Act under the Clinton administration, they were cut off from that. And the saddest part is, like, we don't have oncologists on island. And now that some of the nuclear victims have been cut off from that avenue of Medicaid and Medicare in the US, they have to come up with money that they probably most likely don't have. So it's like a death sentence for many Marshallese victims that have gotten cancer, and they have a predisposition to cancer that wasn't always there. And one of the things that people don't realize is because these people are largely subsistence lifestyle people, people don't understand that radiation, there's always that cumulative dose, where if you keep eating stuff from that radioactive land, or like the food that you ingest, like it builds up after a while. And that's why Marshallese people, some of these people in Eniwetok and some people even in the Marshall Islands, have some of the highest rates of cancer in the world. But of course, as discussions were said earlier, like, they don't believe in intergenerational effects. So right now, I'm just going to stop there. I mean, there's a wealth of information I could share, but I just wanted to update what's the Marshall Islands doing right now. Now that like we have a Compact 3 now, I guess this is the third round of negotiations to adjust the Compact. We finally have a nuclear steering committee in the Compact negotiations, where it's like specific and they're addressing the issue specifically in the negotiations. And they're actually trying to advocate for healthcare and all of that, and just compensation. And I'll stop right there. Thank you, Dr. Tugzhan and Arms Controls Association, for giving the Marshall Islands this opportunity to share some aspects of our story. Thank you.
Desmond, thank you so much. And please don't go away. Please don't fall asleep, because I'm sure there will be questions for you. Alimzhan, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening and good morning, everyone. First of all, let me thank the organizers, Arms Control Association and the Center for Policy Research for this event, for invitation and the opportunity to speak. As Dr. Kazykhanov mentioned, the Center for International Security and Policy was founded in February 2017, and one of the most important areas of our work is nuclear disarmament. Let me talk about it from the perspective of my own country. You might be aware that the former Semipalatinsk test site polygon, the size of it is 18.5 thousand square kilometers, which can be compared with some small countries. And approximately around 500 nuclear tests were conducted, including 116 in atmosphere. Around 1.5 million people have suffered from nuclear tests. At present, the fourth generation of victims of nuclear tests has appeared in Kazakhstan, and unfortunately, the consequences of these explosions continue to affect people till now. These children continue to suffer from various illnesses. These are cancers, Down diseases, cerebral palsy, and many, many others. The worst thing is that, according to medicine studies, the chain of diseases cannot be stopped. And when we last year traveled to Semipalatinsk city and the villages around the city, in the city I met the victim in the third generation, and he shared with me his story that he was born without collarbones and teeth, but the most awful that he shared with me that he was thinking a lot, and he made a decision that he will not have the family, and he's not going to have children because he's afraid that his disease will go to his children. And when I was looking at him and listening to him, I realized that that the tragedy has a face. It's not an abstract. So what we can do now is, of course, first of all, to strengthen medical and social assistance to the victims of nuclear tests. And for example, we visited a family in Karaul where a little girl was sick with the cancer, and it fortunately was cured. Officially, the diagnosis was withdrawn, and funding for examination and observation was stopped. While it remains necessary to undergo and control examination in the capital, in Astana, every 6 months. And unfortunately, this family is unable to cover these costs. These and other loopholes in the medicine and social assistance must be eliminated. However, there is some progress in this. This year, on August 29, the president of Kazakhstan, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, in his appeal to the nation, said that the government is considering a further gradual expansion of the range of social guarantees for this category of citizens in Kazakhstan. Unfortunately, to this date, the situation is that Semi region received more help from abroad than from its own government. Secondly, what is important is to block the access to the former test site. This problem remains relevant to this day in our country. Livestock continues to graze at the polygon, people fish at the atomic lake, and the meat and the fish where it go for sale is not tracked. Also, it is important to note that it is impossible to measure a certain area and to guarantee and say that there is no radiation and will not be there never, since the upper contaminated layer can move during strong winds. I hope that Kazakhstan and of course other countries will take more decisive actions in the direction of medical and social support, as well as ensuring environmental safety, as this fixed in Article 6 of the TPNW, which Kazakhstan ratified last year. And the third, to my mind, also very important direction in which we should work It's important to give the opportunity to victims of nuclear tests to share their stories and be heard by international community to as many victims of nuclear tests in Kazakhstan as possible. The variety and diversity of stories of victims told in the first person will help Kazakhstan to show the scale of tragedy to the world community. For example, what I've learned from Japanese NGOs, that they, for the last 10 years, they brought 1,000 hibakushas to the United Nations and US universities in New York. Kazakhstan cannot remain aloof from this work. By supporting and sharing personal stories of victims as part of educational process in the field of nuclear disarmament, Kazakhstan will not only pay tribute to its own people, but also make an important contribution to the global process of banning nuclear weapons. The lives of these people and other victims around the world should not allow us to give up on nuclear disarmament. Thank you. And if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Alimzhan. What strikes me is how many parallels there are among the different communities, how these communities, how important land was for them, and also in terms of the power dynamics, that the nuclear testing mostly happened in places where people didn't have much power to, at least in the beginning, to stand up and to have any say in what was happening to their lives and their livelihoods. I want to ask our panelists a couple of questions each, and we'll go in reverse order. So Alimzhan, if I can start with you. We had a couple of questions that came in advance. How well informed is the Kazakh public about the legacy of nuclear tests? Because in the United States, except for indigenous people or people, the downwinders themselves, the public knows almost nothing. And the second question, and I really appreciate it, how did the symbol of the Nevada movement, which is a Kazakh elder and the Western Shoshone tribal elder with a peace pipe, how did it come about? For Desmond, once I was listening to somebody talking about the experience of the Marshallese, and what struck me was one particular story, which I think shows so well how the legacy lives on to today and how it impacts the deep cultural essence of the people. And that was, the throat singing, which is so important for Marshallese people, and the fact that because of thyroid cancers and other illnesses, that people cannot do what is so essential to their cultural heritage. If you could speak a little bit to that. And also there was a very small piece in the news about some kind of meeting that happened in the late July with the US ambassador to the Marshall Islands, I believe. And the piece itself was very short, and it mostly said, it was very positive, there is hope. Just if you have any additional information that is not available in the public about that. And for Tina, just a few days ago, there was finally the study on cancer rates among the downwinders of the Trinity test. And first of all, it took 75 years for the study to come out. And I just want to ask you if you could speak briefly about the findings, what you think about the findings. And the second question, if you could briefly tell us about, we know that there are a lot of tribal lands that suffered, and the people from the tribes suffered a lot, and just if you could speak to that angle of the US story. Alimzhan, we'll start with you, please.
Yes, thank you. Okay. Well, first question, awareness. It's like how to say, problem, because young generation in Kazakhstan, and I think around the world, is not very well aware about the nuclear weapons, nuclear weapon itself, and nuclear testing in particular. And in Kazakhstan, the reality is that last year, when I was invited as a guest lecturer to university to talk about nuclear disarmament, I found out that, of course, most part of the students from Kazakhstan knew about Semipalatinsk, former Semipalatinsk test site, but there were some people, some students who was not aware about this issue at all. So this is the problem that we should keep talking about it. We should raise this issue at every moment when it's possible. And in Kazakhstan, we have, of course, as you know, August 29, the date when this issue broadly raises in Kazakhstan. And we have February 28. It's the date when the Nevada Semipalatinsk movement was established in Almaty in 1989. Regarding the second question, as far as I know, as Olja Suleimanov, the founder and the leader of Nevada Semipalatinsk movement, he said that it was like spontaneously they made up this symbol, and why they named the movement Nevada Semipalatinsk is to show that it's international, global movement, and it's joint movement with Kazakhstani people and American people. I don't know if I answered the second question. I guess not.
No, you did. What I also read is that initially, even the name of the Kazakh anti-nuclear movement initially was just Nevada, then they added Semipalatinsk, so it was even more primary. And I think it's very moving that when people of Kazakhstan started protesting against nuclear tests, and you can see the symbol, thank you, on the screen. I think it's very moving that quite a few downwinders from the United States, including members of the Western Shoshone tribe, came to Kazakhstan, and I think there was a lot of mutual inspiration going on there. So thank you. Desmond.
As far as your first question regarding culture and the throat, yeah, Marshallese have this saying where like you take words to heart, but when they say heart, they say purwam, meaning your throat. So already like because it's an oral culture, so for them it is degrading to lose that part of you that makes you who you are. But many of these victims, they still speak as if this story was still yesterday. And one of the things that, aside from being very rooted in their verbal culture, there's also that navigation aspect and that that self-sufficiency aspect in which they always took care of themselves before colonizers and imperial powers came in and disrupted their lifestyle. These were people that were self-sufficient. They made do with what they have in their natural environment, and they were able to take care of themselves. And you would think that the Compact of Free Association would promote that kind of self-sufficiency, but it has led to greater dependencies and greater NCDs, non-communicable diseases, that weren't always there. In fact, when the Navy did a survey in the 1940s, there was no evidence of non-communicable diseases whatsoever. So it happened after the fact. And as far as your second question in terms of whether there's positive engagement with the US because of the meeting with Ambassador Cabral, I would say yes, it's actually positive, considering the ambassador before, she was very sympathetic. So there was some engagement, and that ambassador, I believe, is Karen Stewart, will be serving as the US delegate for the US delegation for Compact 3 negotiations. So the new Ambassador Cabral's response, where they were kind of positive, is kind of, it gives us a sense of hope, but we can't know for sure because, we've had our hopes crushed for so long that I believe we won't know for sure until, the compact negotiations actually happen. The 177 agreement is not an expiring provision, but still it's inadequate to address the needs of the nuclear affected communities and the new claimants that were affected by the bombs but weren't legally recognized under the Compact Free Association. So that's where I see where the problem is, and I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Desmond. And there is just so much more to learn. I hope that everybody who participates in this webinar will be compelled to learn more. Tina, please.
Well, let me just say that the National Cancer Institute released a study this week after spending millions of dollars in 7 years and having full force of the scientists at the National Cancer Institute, that they pressed by saying it had huge limitations because much of it was based on assumptions, estimations, etc. And what struck me is that couldn't say anything definitive. And to me, we don't know anything more today than we did 3 years ago. And that's absolutely unacceptable, because these sorts of reports do have negative consequences to work that we do. And I believe that the primary investigator, Dr. Simon, produced a similar report about the Marshall Islands, where he also said the cancer risk to the Marshallese is very limited from their exposures. And so this is not a new phenomenon. It's been going on. And these studies, I believe, develop sort of suppress the work that we do, and to also make lived experiences that we've had somewhat significant. And I say that because you touched upon this earlier, that it seems like so many of us were marginalized communities. When I see the faces that are participating today, I realize we're marginalized communities. And they counted on us to be unsophisticated, uneducated, and unable to speak up for ourselves at the time of testing. But we're not those people any longer. And I want to tell you that maybe the most egregious part of the NC study is that they refused to address the infant mortality that took place in New Mexico subsequent to the test. We had a 10-year steady decline in infant mortality in Mexico up until the summer of 1945. And after the test, the vital statistics show that we had these huge spikes, significant spike in infant mortality, probably associated with the fact that women were feeding their babies, concentrating radiation in mammary glands, and then poisoning their children. And this is unconscionable. And for the National Cancer Institute to deliver a report that is not in any way definitive, refuse to address infant mortality, and re-victimize us again is absolutely unconscionable, outside of imagination. But you asked if the native communities in Mexico and how they've been affected. Well, we have large uranium mines and all the associated waste with that in New Mexico. And that associated waste, a lot of those sites have been Superfund sites for more than 2 years, and yet they have 10-year plans to address. And what happens is they continue to treat us as marginalized communities. And when I looked at the NCI study, what struck me maybe first about it, that they used the plume map that was long ago developed, not using current day standards or technologies available to us. And those plume maps actually show the major part of the plume from Trinity going off in northeasterly direction, which the physicians assigned to at the time said that if the thought goes in an easterly direction, that will be great for us, because that's the most unpopulated part of New Mexico. Mm-hmm. But the NC study they reported on this actually predicted that not a single native person was affected, because none of that thought went to any of the reservations or pueblos that we have in New Mexico. Yeah. So according to them, one single Native American indigenous part of our population was affected by the fallout, which to me sounds like such a design. And so, we're unhappy with the NCI report because we feel like it's a revictimization of the populations that have been so negatively affected. They didn't spend very much time here, and there are huge limitations with their study. And I actually would challenge anybody out there who's on this webinar, who wants to interact with us, to view those papers and look at the shortcomings and help us to point those out. We would gladly accept that assistance. We can no longer settle for the U.S. government coming back and doing these half efforts at sort of predicting what's taken place 75 years ago.
Thank you so much, Tina, and thank you for your call for action and support from the participants. I'm sure there are some experts listening to this. I just want to close with the last question to all the speakers. If you could use 10 seconds each in the order that you presented, and just tell us how can people who are interested learn more, you know, take what we discussed in this webinar, and where are additional resources, where can people go to? Daryl, and then
Well,
10 seconds each, please.
Yes, thanks, Togjan. Thanks, everybody else. This has been tremendous. There are a lot of resources online. You can go to the Arms Control Association. About the history of the nuclear test ban and movement to stop nuclear testing, information about and articles about some of the effects of nuclear testing. We also have a special website, projectforthectbt.org, which has a variety of resources in one place.
Excellent. Gohar?
Sorry, unmuting. So shameless promotion of our parent organizations, I suppose. Yes. So the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, we work a lot with the diplomatic community. And so if you're interested in that side of issues, we did have a study on actual ways to maybe look at the provisional application or entry into force of the CTBT. And we have that on our website. Our big parent organization in Monterey, the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, has done lots more work over the years about these issues, and has also developed learning modules and profiles, treaty profiles, and chronological record of developments of regarding the CTBT for the Nuclear Threat Initiative website. So nti.org, vcdnp.org, non-proliferation.org.
Yes.
Poke around, you'll
we put
find
the
a lot
links
of
in the chat for everyone.
Yeah,
Tina?
thank you.
Thank you, Gohar.
So we have a very good website that people can access at www.trinitydownwinders.com. And people can go and learn everything that they would ever know about the work that we do. And our contact information, my contact information, is at that website, and I would encourage people to go there if they want to learn more about how they can assist.
Thank you, Tina. Desmond?
Hi, I'll just speak real quick. There's already a link I gave for the National Nuclear Commission's Facebook page, and they're constantly giving updates on what it is that they're doing. And but you know, like, they're very open, and you just shoot them a message on their Facebook page, and then contact information, and they'll give you the information that you're seeking. I guess
Thank you,
that's
Desmond. Alimzhan?
Well, I will mention the Atom Project, where you can learn about Kazakhstan and the initiative of Kazakhstan. About the Atom is an acronym of Abolish Testing Our Mission. Also, of course, UN website and the chapter about disarmament. And I would mention also as our center is a member of ICANN, the website of International Campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, and very useful the website of Reaching Critical Will, where you can find all the statements of all the states on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you who stayed with us, and for all the participants, all the presenters. We thank the Embassy of Kazakhstan for support. I'm personally grateful to each speaker, and I'm grateful for the excellent questions that we received before and during our webinar. And as we've mentioned, please feel free to follow up with all the speakers, and we hope you will find the resources mentioned useful. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.